On November 16, 2004, one of the greatest games of all time was released. With its rich lore, compelling narrative, and technological advancements, this game changed the gaming landscape forever. And after 15 years, the next installment of its series was announced. That game was Half-Life 2. Believe it or not, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines released on the same day, and the similarities don't end there. Both games utilize the Source engine, had new games announced in 2019, and similarly to Half-Life 3, we seem destined to wonder if we'll ever get to play Bloodlines 2 at all. Just days ago, Paradox Interactive announced the game would no longer release this year. Anyone familiar with the tumultuous history of Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines will certainly begin to worry not only about the future of the game, but of what stage in development the game is really in. Despite being a beloved cult classic, Bloodlines was a commercial failure. The game sold less than 72,000 copies, and its failure led to the closure of its developer, Troika Games. The debate over whether Troika or the game's publisher Activision were ultimately at fault for the failure of Bloodlines has been going on in the gaming community ever since. While I'm incredibly anxious to revisit the World of Darkness and all of its next-gen glory, the development story of the original Bloodlines can help us not only understand what may be happening with Bloodlines 2, but why its delay may be a good thing. In 1997, after the critical success of Fallout, 3 of its core members left Interplay during Fallout 2's production following disputes with upper management regarding the direction of the team. Tim Kaine, Leonard Boyarsky, and Jason Anderson formed Troika Games, a company devoted to creating story-centric role-playing games for the PC. Whether through chance or providence, this would ultimately prove the right decision, as Interplay folded less than a year later, leaving the future of the Fallout franchise in the hands of this company.
You're still alive? Christ!
Troika soon released their first game, Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, an isometric 2D steampunk RPG akin to Fallout. Despite being developed out of a garage, the game was a commercial success that paved the way for Troika to expand. This success caught the attention of 2 major gaming companies looking for the next big RPG. In 2001, Troika split its team into 2. One of the teams partnered with Atari, known for sticking with tried and true concepts, and began development of the Temple of Elemental Evil, another 2D isometric RPG based on the Dungeons & Dragons adventure module by the same name. The other team, however, felt the RPG genre was ready for something new and approached Activision with an idea, a 3D first-person RPG. With full 3D games on the rise and the commercial success of Vampire the Masquerade Redemption only a year earlier, the publisher suggested Troika should use their Vampire the Masquerade license to make a sequel, and Troika was in. Vampire the Masquerade is a tabletop RPG akin to Dungeons & Dragons released by White Wolf Publishing. The game takes place in the World of Darkness setting where vampires, werewolves, and other creatures of the night thrive. Troika began pre-production by delving deep into the source material. Troika quickly decided they wouldn't make a direct sequel to Redemption. While Redemption focused on the ancient origin and life of one vampire, Troika opted instead to tell a story based entirely in the modern world with a character the player could customize from the ground up. Vampire the Masquerade is an extremely complex RPG. With 13 vampire clans, 14 unique bloodlines or disciplines, and a myriad of customization options, the design team quickly began the arduous process of fleshing out the gameplay concepts. However, it was actually Anderson, while visiting World of Darkness fan sites, who made perhaps the biggest revelation about the direction of the game. Players cared far more about character and social interaction than anything else. Whereas D&D players generally favored the combat and puzzle-solving aspects of the game, World of Darkness players were far more interested in the roleplay. It became clear that the 3D engine Troika used had to deliver an experience that fans of the World of Darkness expected. The question came down to whether Troika would build their own engine or use an existing one. While they were deliberating this decision, as if a greater power intervened, Boyarsky received a call from a close friend asking him to come down and see what his company was working on. In 1998, fledgling company Valve released Half-Life, a first-person shooter made from a heavily modified Quake engine that was quickly recognized as one of the greatest games ever made. Valve knew that their next game had to surpass expectations, and as such spent a great deal of development time building a new engine, which would allow them to do things in games that had never been done before. Amazed by the progress of the engine's graphical fidelity and facial animation capabilities, Scott Lynch, Chief Operations Officer of Valve, reached out to Boyarsky and invited his team to visit the Valve offices to see the future of gaming. Troika dropped everything and went the same day. After seeing the engine, Troika was sold. Source was the engine they needed to make their vision of Vampire the Masquerade a reality, but there was one big problem. Source was still in development and not available for commercial release. But once again, as if some force was propelling this game forward, Lynch's support of Troika Games and Valve's own interest in Activision publishing their games cemented a deal between the three companies that granted Troika exclusive access to the new Source engine with the caveat that they could not release the game before Half-Life 2. The pieces were in place for development of the game to begin in earnest, but little did Troika know that they had set themselves up for destruction. With such a powerful engine now in their hands, the design team began to quickly expand on their ideas. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines would not only let the player join one of 7 distinct vampire clans that offered their own benefits and powers, but every NPC in game would have their dialogue, conversation options, and voice acting altered depending on your choice. These changes varied from slight changes to the dialogue to NPCs immediately running away in fear from you. Further customization in the way of attributes, abilities, and disciplines further altered how the player interacted with NPCs and objectives. While this extreme level of customization and choice allowed players to create wholly unique characters, it also meant that Troika had to ensure players could progress the game regardless of their choices. Rather than take the easy way out by making your character choices irrelevant to the progress of the game, they instead ensured every single quest area had some way of progressing the quest forward based on the stats the players chose. While this sounds absolutely incredible, it meant that the development team lacked clear focus and direction in their game design. The game had to work based entirely on the randomness of player choice. Regardless, development of the game proceeded forward for years with one very critical flaw. Activision had not assigned a producer to oversee Troika's development. On May 6, 2003, Activision publicly revealed Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. The press release alluded to many features that in the end would not make it into the game, including a multiplayer component that was meant to be a big part of it. Whether Activision failing to assign a producer to the game was due to their confidence in Troika or incompetence on their part is a matter of debate. Regardless, David Mullich, known predominantly for his work in the Heroes of Might and Magic series, was eventually assigned to the Bloodlines project to ensure it would meet its anticipated release date. While Mullich expended to find a game mostly complete, he found instead a game that was effectively in shambles. The team added levels and features only to abandon them without being properly removed, and worst of all, the game ran horribly. In fact, a common complaint of the game is that the first chapter, Santa Monica, is so rich in detail in comparison to the rest of the game. This is due in large part to the developers not moving forward with development until much later while they tried and tested new things. Troika had acquired a source engine that was incomplete and in development. As such, many of the issues Valve would eventually resolve before its release instead were hastily patched up by Troika. Any documentation or resources on how to code in the engine were entirely non-existent. As such, the game was poorly implemented into the source engine and it showed. The situation was so bad that Mullich worked directly out of Troika Studios, driving 180 miles round trip every day just to get the game back on track. Mullich spent 6 months trying to get the game ready, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough. After going over budget and missing multiple deadlines, Activision finally put their foot down. Activision had done everything in their power to right the ship. The publishing company even paid for Troika's development of the Temple of Elemental Evil, just so that Troika could funnel more resources into Bloodlines. But in 2004, they could no longer justify the costs and gave Troika a hard deadline to submit the game on September 15, 2004. Troika spent the next several months removing features and content that was simply not ready to ensure they had a stable product to deliver. While they submitted the game on time, it was incredibly unstable and buggy. Troika hoped that they would be able to further address any issues during the QA and testing process. But for some reason, Activision allotted just 3 weeks to test the game. Keep in mind that Activision was contractually obligated to hold the release of the game until at least November 16, 2004. This would have given them at least 2 months of testing and code fixes before manufacturing the final product. But for reasons unknown, they chose not to do this, and instead released Bloodlines on the same day as Half-Life 2. Despite game-breaking bugs and poor performance, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines released with generally favorable reviews. However, the game simply could not compete in the market. Games such as Half-Life 2, Metal Gear Solid 3, and Halo 2 released that same month. The game sold 72,000 copies in its initial release, making it Troika's worst performing game. After Bloodlines' release, Troika laid off half of its staff. The remaining employees worked diligently to patch the game for a month before being fired. In what I can only describe as a true show of love for their project, some former employees actually stuck around and tried to fix the game pro bono. But by February 2005, unable to secure any further game contracts, Troika closed its doors, leaving Bloodlines an unfinished and unplayable mess. Years later, Anderson stated in an interview that although Troika Games' library had been critically well received, consistent technical issues had marred the perception of the company's games, contributing to their difficulty in obtaining new projects. Bloodlines' lead writer Brian Mitsoda said in a 2016 interview that everyone, including the developers, were always going to wonder what the game could have been if they had just been given another 6 months. Despite this, the fate of Bloodlines wasn't set in stone. Fans of Vampire the Masquerade rallied together and started an initiative to fix the game themselves. One man was actually solely responsible for restoring the majority of cut content into the game, going so far as to contact the former developers to ask them what they intended to do with the missing content. Today, you can play the Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines without issue as long as you install the unofficial patch. In the end, did Activision ruin Troika's vision of Vampire the Masquerade, or did Troika bite off more than they could chew? You could argue either way, and I believe both statements are true. So while it disheartens me that Bloodlines 2 has been delayed, I'm confident that such a move means Paradox has learned from the mistakes made during Bloodlines development. While we won't know the specifics of the development history of Bloodlines 2 for much later, we can assume that for whatever reason, Heartsuit Labs was not delivering on Paradox's vision of Vampire the Masquerade. Had Troika been less idealistic about the game that they wanted to make, and if Activision had given the game more time rather than rush its release, the history of Bloodlines may have been completely different. After all, as Shigeru Miyamoto said, a delayed game is eventually good, but a rushed game is forever bad. I'll be patiently waiting for Bloodlines 2 to release, and in the meantime, I'm gonna fire up Bloodlines and scare the crap out of myself in the Ocean House Hotel. See you in the next one.